Whether you've been married for 5 years or 25 years, sometimes we really don't realize where certain patterns came from in our current marriage. We don't realize how our parents' marriage impacts probably our current marriage and some of the things we may have inadvertently carried into our current marriage today. And in the last couple of videos, I've had to make these videos into parts because they are significantly lengthy. And in the first one, we talked about, the fighting, the dishonesty, feeling unfulfilled, and the disappointment. In the second video, we talked about, the kids becoming our end-all, be-all. It's all about the kids. The fun that went away in the relationship and how one parent might have not have been home and how the other parent had to keep up and was constantly there taking up the slack and how that impacted not only their relationship, but also how it impacted our childhood. So now let's deep dive into 3 last concepts that I want to bring up because I think these are very important. And the first one is about how one parent might have always been working, constantly working. And I know that we have to make ends meet. I know that we have to pay the bills. I know that it has to be taken care of. But sometimes it felt like that one person, that one parent was always traveling for work, always working, didn't have time for the family. And I think that we see that right now in a lot of marriages now, in a lot of relationships where, the person learned that, like my dad, his goal was to make sure that there was food on the table and that the mortgage was paid and that was taken care of. And that was his job. That was what he did. And then a lot of men follow that same suit. Hey, I'm going to follow what my dad did, not realizing the impact it has, but I'm going to make sure I take care of my family and provide at all costs. And so sometimes that can leave one family member at the house all the time. And if you're in a marriage like that right now, how is that impacting you? And I know that we do have to pay the bills and I understand the responsibility, but sometimes that can also be a mechanism for separation as far as not having the big conversations. Also, it can maybe leave the one parent that's there, even though they might be working, but they're at the house more or what have you, maybe having a lot of resentment and feeling unfulfilled as well. And even the person that's on the road that's having to work so hard, maybe they're feeling unfulfilled, like they don't have a life, that they're having to do all this work. And so I find that actually brings a lot of resentment into the marriage because one person thinks that they're overworking, one person feels like the other person's never around and that they have to take care of the kids. And so that becomes like this dissension in the marriage where a lot of times that never gets talked about. That's one of the big pieces, but it never gets discussed. And so other pieces start falling apart too. Like the intimacy level starts going down because you're not even around each other that much. The deep conversations aren't happening because you're not there to have the deep conversations anymore. So it just becomes like a quick call or a hey, or the person's getting home by the time you're going to bed, or the person's getting home while you're already asleep. And so that's not allowing for not only communication, but intimacy at any level. Another concept that I want to bring up too is that when you were at the house, parents there, you might have recognized that one parent wasn't very attentive. It seems like they were kind of there, going through the motions, but not really aware. And I find that can be a very interesting concept too, is that could be impacting your current marriage as well. One person might be kind of going through the motions while the other person's really trying to be attentive and trying to be on point. And that can be hard because if one person's attentive and one person's not, you're really having that mixed match. That one person's not really listening or getting it. And I think when I was growing up, one of the things that I caught is one of my parents didn't really listen very well to my other parent. And so the other person was always saying, huh, what? I didn't hear you. And was really never concentrating on what the other person was saying. And eventually the other person just got angry and upset and just stayed quiet. Over time, it was like, why am I talking? Nobody's listening to me anyway. And so I find that that's when people really shut down too, is that when they feel that the other person's not being attentive and not really there, they're just kind of going through the motions. And you might be in a marriage right now where you feel that your wife or your husband is going through the motions. Maybe you feel like they're not very attentive of your needs. And I know that sometimes we can't expect somebody to read our mind. But maybe we need to speak up, but maybe you're afraid to speak up because you're afraid of having an argument or a conflict. You're afraid of hurting their feelings by saying that you're not getting intimacy or you don't feel like you're being fulfilled or whatever that looks like. And so it's interesting how, the inattentiveness almost becomes something that's there. It's the elephant in the room. And then a lot of times we might overlook it with something else because it doesn't seem to be able to be cured or changed. Then we just kind of either refocus in our own life or refocus in our work or refocus in the kids or refocus in the pets, whatever we can do, or refocus on the lawn in order to offset that. And so that can be an aspect that's happening in your marriage right now. And being able to pinpoint that, it's not about saying, you're inattentive and putting your finger in their face, but it's more like, okay, I'm catching that my spouse is really inattentive, not really listening to anything I'm saying, kind of just going through the motions. It's almost like they're not really here. How do we open the line of communication with that? And the last concept I want to talk about in this video is that maybe when you were growing up, when you look at the family dynamic, one parent was extremely self-centered, maybe even a little bit of narcissism, maybe even a lot of narcissism. And that can be a very interesting concept too, because, as a parent, you're supposed to be there, you're supposed to be there for your kids, but a lot of times when a parent is really self-centered, it's really all about them, right? So that's an interesting concept. And sometimes because of those types of personalities in our life, especially if one of those types of personalities was one of our parents, we might not really realize that. So we might have married somebody or be in a relationship currently with somebody that might be a little more self-centered than we are. Maybe they focus on themselves a little more. Maybe it's all about them quite a bit. And, we don't want to sit there and yell out narcissists and all this kind of stuff and generalize and define and diagnose. But at the same time, we want to sit there and see if that's existing in our current marriage. Is it in your current relationship? And how are you dealing with it? Because sometimes when somebody's self-centered, they might be doing all these things and getting away with all this stuff in their day-to-day life, and you're kind of just there helping them out. Maybe you don't even feel like you're really an equal, or you don't really feel heard. Because, and it's interesting because when I look back growing up, my parents, would have conversations, but I realized that one of my parents would talk a lot more than the other parent about how they were feeling and how their day was and all that kind of stuff. And there was occasional questions asked back, about how they were doing, but they were occasional. And that's interesting too, because if you're in a relationship like that, you might not feel like you're heard. You also might feel like you're kind of second fiddle, in the situation. But also it's like, how do you turn that around? How do you work on that? How do you bring that up? Because a relationship can only survive so long, when both people don't really feel like there's some sort of equality or general concern for one another. And I think that's something too that's interesting, and that can also play a role. So we might have seen it play out with our parents' dynamic, and then we might see some sort of similar role being played out in our current marriage. And so being able to recognize that as well, and then how do we deal with it? Once we recognize it and realize it's there, and then how do we bring it up, or how do we talk about it, or how do we open the lines of communication so that everybody feels heard and understood. So I hope this has helped you. If you've liked this video, please give us a thumbs up on this video that says that you like the video and you like the content that you're watching. Also, let me know, are you dealing with a situation like this in your current marriage, and how are you dealing with it? Because that's the biggest question, is how do we get over that hurdle? How do we have the deep conversations? How do we end some of these patterns that we've seen in our parents' marriage? How do we end some of the patterns that we see in our current marriage and be able to make things better, or at least talk about it? And that's the big question, because I think the one thing that's missing from a marriage that is not solid is communication. Because we have to say it. Ultimately, it's going to come out anyway, one way or another, and if it doesn't, there's just going to be regret, and you're going to wonder, what if I said that? What if I brought it up? What if I said it? What would have happened? But we wouldn't know what happened because we never brought it up. So I'd love to hear some of your input on that, because I think that anybody that's been in a marriage, it doesn't matter how long you've been in a marriage, but the longer you've been in a marriage, I think the harder it is to have that conversation, the harder it is to communicate, because there's been so much time and there might be so much fear built up over time about not wanting to hurt that person's feelings or not wanting to talk about the elephant in the room. So this is a really interesting conversation. I'd love to read your thoughts and also start a conversation here with other people that are also dealing with some of these same situations. Also, I have lots of videos on marriage and the roommate situation, identifying the roommate situation, identifying a solid marriage, what makes a solid marriage, looking at the aspects of our parents' marriage and how it impacts our current marriage and those patterns. So I hope that you can also watch some of that content as well. In the meantime, you know it. Don't forget to live your true life.